In 1962, in one of the most influential speeches of the 20th century, President Kennedy challenged the United States to land a man on the moon.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Less than 7 years later, on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong set foot on the lunar surface.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
In the decades that followed, many presidents and their administrations have attempted to recapture the spirit of Apollo.
For the coming decade, for the 1990s space station freedom, our critical next step in all our space endeavors, and next for the new century, back to the moon, back to the future, and this time back to stay. And then a journey into tomorrow, a journey to another planet, a manned mission to Mars.
Return to the moon by 2020. We will then be ready to take the next steps of space exploration, human missions to Mars, and to worlds beyond.
By the mid-2030s, I believe we can send humans to orbit Mars and return them safely to Earth. And a landing on Mars will follow. And I expect to be around to see it.
And return American astronauts to the moon, establish a permanent base there, and develop the technologies to take American astronauts to Mars and beyond.
But despite these grandiose visions of building lunar outposts or landing people on Mars, human spaceflight has remained confined to low Earth orbit since 1972. NASA's latest initiative, the Artemis program, proposes returning astronauts to the moon's surface by 2024. A mission to Mars may then follow sometime in the future. Will things be different this time? What is standing in the way of NASA achieving these goals? And ultimately, will we ever get to see NASA land people on Mars?
Hey there everyone, Ryan MacDonald, Martian Colonist here, and welcome to this special live stream. And what a special day that we are celebrating today. 50 years since Neil Armstrong first set foot onto the moon, in one of the culminating and defining events of the 20th century. So all throughout this live stream I will be monitoring your comments over there in the live feed, and they will be kept up after the live feed today. I want to start off though by taking a little look more concretely at what NASA's current plans are, and then we can delve in a little bit into how feasible they are, how long it might take to go on from the moon onto Mars, and depending on how the conversation goes based on your comments, we may also take a look at some of the other key players in the field for trying to take us to Mars in the near future. So first up, NASA's Project Artemis, which has a wonderful fancy new logo, which was just announced yesterday, I believe. Artemis, of course, was the twin sister of Apollo in Greek mythology, which is certainly apt for this plan to return to the moon, potentially with the first landing occurring by 2024. There are three key components to NASA's vision for the Artemis program. The first is the crew capsule, called Orion, which has been developed for many years now. In fact, Orion is one of the legacies of the second George Bush that we saw there, the plan that he announced in 2004, the Constellation program. Orion is the only part of that that really remains to the day. Orion will be able to carry up to 4 astronauts into space. It has been specially manufactured to be reinforced against things like radiation and micrometeorites. So although it has the appearance of resembling the Apollo capsules, it is far more advanced in many key respects. That does mean that it's a bit heavier though than the Apollo capsule at around 10 tons. So you need a very capable and powerful rocket to be able to launch Orion into orbit around the moon or further out in the solar system. And that rocket will be the Space Launch System,
or SLS, being developed right now by NASA to be a mega rocket far more powerful even than the Saturn V rocket, which was the backbone of the Apollo missions. Here we see the SLS launching Orion towards the orbit of the moon. But what will there actually be out at the moon? Because although these are Orion plus the SLS are the two key components of NASA's vision, ultimately what they want to do as part of the Artemis program is not just to land on the moon, plant a flag, collect some samples and return, but they want to make it sustainable. They want to create a base there in the long term. And this is what we see being illustrated here, one of the key components for sustainability, which is the Lunar Gateway, which has had a number of names over the years, but effectively this would be an outpost in a high orbit around the moon, which would enable you to dock Orion to it, refuel, get new supplies, stay for short periods of time around the moon, and plan precisely where you are going to land. Because the Apollo missions were limited to land just on the equator of the moon, but one of the most important things that really sets the Artemis program apart is where it's going to land. And that is that it's really going to be prioritizing the south polar region of the moon. And why is that important? Well, within the last decade or so, particularly in 2008, we have learnt that there are large deposits of water ice existing at the moon, particularly in permanently shadowed craters in the polar regions. And water ice is critical not just so that you can purify it and then drink it, or even electrolyze it to produce oxygen for a habitat to make your drinking water and breathable air, but also because you can manufacture propellants, rocket fuels on the moon, which could then reduce the cost of these various missions and make them more sustainable in the long term. So let's now take a little look at how NASA is actually proposing within the next 5 years, as we heard Mike Pence proposing there, to return people to the moon. The Artemis 1 mission will see the first SLS launch with Orion on top. There will be no crew in the original Artemis 1 mission. Here we see, right at the top, just from the European service module of the Orion capsule, solar panels being deployed, a crucial part of powering the life support systems and various other parts of the Orion capsule. Orion, as we see here, is now engaging its engine to do a translunar injection, taking it on an intercept path to loop around the moon. Now remember, there are no people on board for the Artemis 1 mission. This is crucially designed to check all of the critical components that you would use in a crewed mission, and in fact would be used in the Artemis 2 mission, which follows a very similar profile. Here we see Orion in a reasonably low orbit around the moon on its return trajectory to the Earth. And again, I emphasize this mission is uncrewed, but it would test key aspects of the Orion capsule, like the levels of radiation shielding, and verifying that the life support system functions. So now, as Orion approaches the Earth towards the end of the Artemis 1 mission, or indeed the Artemis 2 mission, it detaches from its service module, reorients itself to place its heat shield towards the Earth's atmosphere. The heat shield heats up to around 2,700 degrees Celsius as it enters the atmosphere, ablating off a lot of that kinetic energy. It deploys drogue chutes and parachutes, gradually slowing down for a gentle descent, floating down into one of the oceans on our home planet. Artemis 1, of course, would be uncrewed. As I've said a few times, Artemis 2 would then have a recovery ship standing by to immediately pick up the astronauts and verify that the mission was a success. The first phase of the Artemis program would see these missions build up towards the big mission, which would be Artemis 3, which would see the first landing on the surface of the moon since 1972. So this graphic, which has been put together by NASA, illustrates some of the components of the Artemis program. Although the flagship missions will involve the Orion missions, the uncrewed missions, the crewed missions, there will also be a number of missions to establish the infrastructure in space. So that will consist of some early modules for the Deep Space Gateway.
there will also be a number of landings on the surface of the moon. This is part of the CLIPS program, or the Commercial Lunar Payload Service. All of these will be launched by commercial rockets to make it cheap and affordable. And there'll be various scientific payloads on these missions. So they'll be looking at things like, what is the concentration of water ice in the lunar soil, and particularly at the poles. They'll be testing the technologies we need to be able to live and work on the moon sustainably in the long term. So things like this critical technology, in situ resource utilization, taking local resources and then using these local resources to be able to produce things like oxygen to breathe and fuel to be able to return cheaply. The Artemis program over a number of years would then expand in its capabilities. So it doesn't just stop when the first crew lands in 2024. Instead, it will gradually then move towards extended stays on the lunar surface, deploying more hardware there, and eventually it would get to the point, potentially by 2028 under current plans, that various components for a prospective base will be gradually built there on the moon. So that gives you a brief overview of the Artemis program as it is currently envisioned. And one of the really critical things that really sets this apart from the Apollo missions back in the day is that Artemis is going to rely a lot on public-private partnerships in order to try and drive the cost down, make it more sustainable, and bring more innovation into the overall program. So, for example, the Deep Space Gateway, which will be assembled, the Space Launch System, which is a very expensive, expendable launch system, costing around $1 billion for every launch, will not be used for that. The various components, things like the propulsion module of the Lunar Gateway, the power module, the habitats, they will all be built by private contractors. They will also be launched on commercial rockets like SpaceX's Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, potentially on rockets that Blue Origin are developing, like New Glenn, for example. I'm going to move a little bit closer to my microphone, so hopefully you'll be able to pick me up a little bit more. Please let me know if that helps. Okay, so we've discussed the Artemis program and the fact that it will use public-private partnerships. I want to briefly touch upon two particular vehicles that NASA could rely on for the Artemis project, I should say, because there are two critical components, two critical technologies which are missing at the moment, and these are a lunar lander and also surface suits suitable to go out on the moon, because what we have for the space station is not ideal. You need something that can withstand the fine particulate matter that you have on the moon, that can cut up your spacesuit if you don't specially engineer for it. So there are a number of companies that have been looking at lander designs that could potentially be used. So for example, Lockheed Martin, in this animation they've put together, are studying one potential lander design we see here docked to the Lunar Gateway. Astronauts transfer from Orion into that landing module. This lander would then detach from the Gateway, go down to the lunar surface, and be able to carry a crew of potentially up to 4 people. Similar proposals also exist from other companies. In particular, Amazon's founder Jeff Bezos, who owns the space company Blue Origin, had a big flashy presentation earlier this year where they unveiled the Blue Moon lander, which they have been developing for 3 years now, so it's well along in the process of development. And one thing that's particularly interesting about this lander is if you look at the engine at the bottom, this B7 engine, it actually uses a combination of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, which crucially you can manufacture on the moon. You don't need to ship there. All you need is just some lunar water ice, which you could extract perhaps by mining some of these shadowed regions in lunar craters, and then you would be able to manufacture your propellant locally. And of course, SpaceX are rapidly making incredibly exciting progress with their Starship vehicle, which could be used for missions to the surface of the moon. There was even an article I saw just a few days ago where Elon Musk said that it may be possible under Elon time to be able to send one of these to the moon in the next 2 years, but then he then clarified that perhaps realistically this means more on the 4-year time frame. And it would be very interesting to look at how something like the Artemis program would evolve if you have the launch and landing capability of a larger vehicle like Starship. Because this would really change the game if you can get payloads not of just a few tons onto the surface of the moon, but potentially up to 10 or 100 tons onto the moon. That would really accelerate the process of building a lunar base, for example. So this is a summary of NASA's current plans to go to the moon. But what we need to critically examine is, what does this mean for Mars? Particularly towards the title of this video, will NASA ever get to Mars? So if you look at what NASA's administrator Jim Bridenstine has been saying, officially the moon is seen as a stepping stone for human missions to Mars. But the details of all of this are relatively light. In fact, one of the first comments that I saw posted today, a great series of comments by Calvin Sylvestre, hopefully I pronounced that right, has particularly commented on this, that there's a big lack of details at the moment in terms of NASA's planning for concrete proposals to return humans to Mars. And there's a report that Calvin cites, which I will actually talk about a little bit later, by the Science and Technology Policy Institute, that specifically examines independently when NASA might feasibly be able to get people to Mars, which we'll talk about in a moment. So before we talk about the concrete details in terms of when NASA might be able to get to Mars, I just want to talk a little bit about the feasibility of just even Artemis going ahead. Because this is not something that is being envisioned within NASA's existing budget that they have. NASA's current budget, by the way, per year is about $20 billion. In order to pull off the Artemis 3 landing in 2024, it's estimated, but they're still doing the sums, that it would cost between $20 and $30 billion on top of NASA's current budget to achieve this, which equates to about a $6 to $8 billion per year increase in NASA's budget. Now, the current US administration is trying to push through at the moment a down payment, if you will, of $1.6 billion in order to start this process rolling, but they're already... that's not approved. It's still going through Congress, and many people do not seem particularly impressed there at the moment. They're perhaps waiting for full costings for the entire program. So, at the moment, although the planning for Artemis and many industrial contracts for things like the lander are already going out into industry, which is great, NASA's doing all the right things, but if they don't have the money, it won't happen. So, it's perhaps more of a political battle. And if Artemis doesn't happen because of the politics, then NASA's Mars program, I should say, will only go further away in the future. So, how might NASA get to Mars if we just put aside the issue of funding? Let's imagine Artemis is successful, NASA has this huge deep space gateway in orbit around the moon, and they've got, for the sake of argument, unlimited funding. What might a Mars mission look like? So, let's take a look at this nice animation that's been put together by Lockheed Martin. Illustrates something that Lockheed likes to call their Mars base camp. So we see a Mars transfer vehicle, which would have been nominally assembled at the Deep Space Gateway, travelling into Mars orbit, where it will dock with a miniature station which has clearly been inspired by the Deep Space Gateway, and so there'd be a lot of shared common heritage in technology there. So you also see this engine firing here, one of the key technologies that would be developed both for a Mars transfer vehicle and for missions to the moon in the Artemis program would be something called solar electric propulsion. So there would be some shared technology and commonalities between these different endeavours. So in this envisioned mission, once the humans are in orbit around Mars, which they would do as a precursor mission before anyone would land on Mars, in fact, similar to the Artemis 1 mission versus Artemis 2 mission, NASA are tentatively planning a 2033 mission to send people to orbit Mars, bring them back, and then at some date in the future, perhaps 2037, try and land on the surface of the moon. Surface of Mars, I should say. Apologies, live streams are always tricky.
So here we see Orion, which would also be some of the shared common heritage, docking with this Mars base camp in orbit around Mars. Astronauts would then transfer into the various different modules, perhaps survey the surface of Mars to identify optimum landing sites. You also see here that there is some potential for missions to the Martian moons. Here we see Phobos, one of the moons of Mars, and there are fascinating scientific reasons to go there, which I won't go into too much detail here, but there are also some key resources on Phobos that could be useful. So, for example, by having an orbital mission to Mars, you have the possibility of having astronauts, like we see here, going into orbit around Phobos to collect samples and perhaps try and figure out how the Martian moons formed, where they came from, and whether there could be any potential resources on Phobos that could be useful. So now, various drones would be deployed to scout out an optimum landing site for the first human landing on Mars. Here we see the cameras, this wonderfully named Mars Eye from the Mars base camp, following their own drone for some reason. Now, though, we're about to see the landing system. If I remember correctly, how this video goes. And note, I see also what looks like a Canadian flag there. It's very important to make all of these missions international, of course. That will be true with the Deep Space Gateway, as it would be true with any notional NASA mission to go onwards to Mars. Whilst waiting for a landing to be attempted, I'll also take a quick look at some of your comments. Please do keep them coming in. I am trying to monitor them, and within the next 2 minutes or so after we've seen this landing, I will turn to some of your comments and start discussing them. So I do see a fair amount of skepticism for the Space Launch System, and particularly whether the Space Launch System will actually be ready on time. So let me just come back for a moment just to comment on that. So the timeline for the Space Launch System, and this is the real rate limiting step, which will determine if Artemis 1 will be on schedule and therefore if the entire Artemis program will actually happen. So the Space Launch System, at least in terms of official planning, is supposed to launch no earlier than June of 2020. But it's looking like it will probably not launch before late 2021 at the moment. It was originally planned to launch, at least I remember it was planned to launch in 2017, but it suffered from many delays, which have increased the cost of the mission. In fact, figures that I've heard for the total development cost for the Space Launch System plus Orion are around $30 billion at the moment, and they still won't be ready until 2021. So they're incredibly expensive. And indeed, potentially this is one of the... If, for example, you get a fully reusable system, like Starship, coming online by late 2020, early 2021, like Elon Musk is envisioning, then I imagine there could be some very serious calls questioning the SLS. Because you can still make the argument at the moment that SLS will be more capable than Falcon Heavy, and hence be able to launch Orion, which is a quite heavy capsule. But if you already have Starship, which could launch many Orions inside of its payload bay, and it's fully reusable, then at that point, SLS, I would be very surprised if the SLS program continues. Not that would be a bad thing for the Artemis program. You could accelerate it. You could land not just 4 people on the moon. You could land 10, 50, even 100 eventually people on the moon. So we should really keep an eye out for Starship's development. And so that's why I really try and track its development in my Mars mission update series. So yeah, thanks very much for your comments there. And let's go back and see how long it takes Lockheed to try and land on Mars in this animation. We see a lot of space. We see Mars Base Camp Alpha. Here we are. Here is Lockheed's proposal for a lander, which looks suspiciously like SpaceX's Starship, if I do say. So here's the lander coming in, potentially orienting itself to do some aero braking in the atmosphere, very similar to what something like Starship would do. It would then fire its engines in order to slow down, because parachutes and aero braking just won't slow you down enough to be able to land successfully on the surface of Mars. Here we see what looks like 6 engines on the base of Lockheed's lander. And then once it touches down, then any astronauts on board, I see Lockheed going for dramatic different camera positions here. I assure you there is an astronaut on board, and we'll see him in just a moment. Here we go. There's our astronaut coming out onto the surface of Mars. So that animation just illustrates kind of, although obviously it's a Lockheed Martin proposal, that's not official NASA planning at the moment, that kind of illustrates the way that NASA might go if they were looking at doing a more classical Mars return mission where they send people, they don't build a full base there, they just scout, collect samples, and perhaps over a 2-year period, return. So now I'd like to take some comments and questions from you. So just over there in the comments on YouTube, please go and drop any questions that you have, and I'll be monitoring it for the next few minutes or so. There is a slight latency here, so whenever I say something, it takes around 30 seconds before you actually hear it. So if it takes you a little while before I get to your comment, don't worry, I am reading them. And if you are watching the recording of this video, by the way, I will also be monitoring any comments which are posted down below. And I do read all of those comments incidentally, and I will try and reply to as many of them as I can. So don't worry if you've missed the live stream, you'll still have a chance to ask some questions. Okay, so let's see what is going on. So B. Ida says that Mars needs women. That's one thing I didn't actually mention that's critically important about the Artemis program. NASA are really pumping in the PR machine that they want to put the first woman and the next man on the surface of the moon as part of the Artemis program. Which would, in many ways, many people say, oh, we've already gone to the moon, just by landing again, would that be as inspirational? And you could make that point, but I would argue that there are many areas of society which did not see themselves reflected in the initial crews that landed on the moon. By landing the first woman on the moon, and also people from many different backgrounds, that will have a much wider catchment area in terms of who it can inspire and get interested in the space program. And so it'll be very important, per your point, for Mars missions to make sure that the crews ideally have 50-50 mixes between men and women, not just for the inspirational argument, but also because various NASA studies on long-term crew cohesion show that mixed crews tend to perform better on long-term isolation missions. Okay, some of your other questions. Jester26UK asks, are there any updates regarding the Skylon? If you don't know, Skylon is a space plane which is being developed out of the UK. They're developing a very novel engine system called Sabre, just south of Oxford, not too far away from me. As far as I know, Sabre, they're trying to scale up Sabre at the moment. They have functioning prototypes that are scaled down. All the technology to achieve a single stage to orbit spaceplane seems to work. They just are trying to build a full-scale Sabre engine and test that now. They have also been expanding, Reaction Engines is the company, into the United States at the moment, which has slowed them down a little bit, but in the long term it will help accelerate their plans. They're very well funded at the moment. They've received startup grants from the UK government of about £60 million, also from the European Space Agency. So they're doing quite well. I haven't heard any recent updates on when Skylon may actually launch, and Skylon could be used incidentally for Mars missions, so it is quite relevant here. But I would expect to see a full engine prototype perhaps within the next year or two, and then if Skylon itself is then funded, perhaps we could see it around 2025. That would be my speculation. So, great question. Thanks very much. Emmett Brown has asked a fantastic question. Can we make an elevator between Mars and Phobos? Yes, absolutely. And there's a great paper written in 2004 called Mars Colonization Using Space Elevators from Phobos, which, if I remember, I will link to in the description of this video, that studies this. So, because Phobos is orbiting so low around Mars, it actually orbits about twice every day. So if you were looking at Phobos from the surface of Mars, you'd see it twice every day. And because it's orbiting so much faster than the rotational speed of Mars, this means that you can't connect an elevator directly between Phobos and the surface of Mars. But you could dangle an elevator from Phobos down to just above the surface, the atmosphere of Mars. You could then launch missions that would launch from the surface and catch the space elevator, dock with it, and then go up to Phobos, potentially for refueling, for instance, or you could even have a base on Phobos. So absolutely, and the great news is you don't need carbon nanotubes for it, like you would for a space elevator on the Earth. these very resilient materials, you could build it out of something like Kevlar. So Martian space elevators dangling from Phobos, absolutely, you could do this. Okay, so next question. Nabefs asks, if SpaceX can technically go to the moon, do they need any legal authorization to land? The short answer here is yes. So if you want to launch anything into space, you need to have a launch license agreed with the country that you're actually planning to launch from. And there's actually a special type of license that you need if you want to go beyond Earth orbit. And my understanding is that only one company has ever been awarded one of those, which I believe is Moon Express. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. Which were one of the companies competing to win the Lunar Google X Prize. And even though the X Prize has expired, they are planning to go to the moon in the future, regardless. So if SpaceX wanted to land on the moon, they would still have to get official permission from the US government, I believe the Federal Aviation Authority, because if something goes wrong in space, and let's say a failed rocket crashes on another country, then the country where the mission launched from will be held responsible, and so that's why there's this kind of legal framework in place. So really good question. Alloy Chloe Price asks, what will happen if Trump doesn't get re-elected? Will Artemis be scrapped like Constellation? So yeah, this is an interesting point, and many people draw particular attention to the fact that Artemis 3 wants to land in 2024, as that will be the end of a notional second Trump presidency. And this has been the story historically. New administrations would come in, and would they want to fulfill the legacy of the previous administration? Often no. Obama wanted to go to an asteroid. That was cancelled after he was no longer president. But that being said, there is consensus that the long-term horizon goal is Mars. And Orion, although it will be focused on the moon initially, is being designed in the long term to be able to go to Mars. So if you can get to the point where the SLS is close to launch, Orion is developing well. In fact, there was a launch abort system test of Orion just a few weeks ago, I believe, which was fantastically successful. So it would be hard to cancel Artemis if a new president came in 2020, if there is sufficient momentum. But that requires that there needs to be cross-party agreement in the US Congress between both Democrats and Republicans that funding a human return to the moon to stay has cross-party partisan support. So if you can get the funding for Artemis agreed and both sides work together, then it will probably still happen. So there is a risk that NASA could be refocused towards Mars. But at the moment, I'm feeling reasonably confident. But we'll have to wait and see how the politics plays out over the next few months. In particular, look out in early 2020 when there should be a full costed budget for Artemis going to Congress. That's when we'll really see if this project is going to go ahead. Christaku B asks, what do I think about the Lunar Gateway in particular? Is it really necessary? It depends what you want to do. If you want to just land on the equator of the moon and repeat the Apollo missions, you don't need a gateway. If you want to have flexibility in terms of where you land on the moon, if you want to have the flexibility of being able to delay choosing a landing site for various reasons, perhaps, I don't know, there's a solar coronal mass ejection coming, for instance, although in hindsight that would probably hit the gateway as well. There are some advantages. Personally, so long as the gateway is developed, each of the components, and launched by commercial rockets, then it should be reasonably affordable, it should be cheap. And so long as the contracts that NASA issues for this have a fixed cost, they're not what's called a cost-plus contract where you just keep paying the company more and more and more until they've built it, then I'm happy to support the gateway, so long as you stick to those requirements, because it would be useful. But yeah, stick its development and its launch in the commercial sector, and then you can be sure that its costs won't spiral out of control. So let's see, other questions that we have. Let's see, and who haven't we heard from so far? So Team Yankee 2 asked, do I think development of the SLS will be scrapped when SpaceX roll out Starship? I don't think it will be as sudden as that. there's still a lot of skepticism in official planning from NASA as to the existence of Starship. I mean, I was at an exoplanet conference last year where I spoke to someone who unveiled that NASA has been studying whether a potential successor to the James Webb Space Telescope, LUVOIR, which is currently being planned for 2035, could launch on Starship and do it a lot cheaper. That study was made well, it wasn't publicly released, but it was officially announced that this study is a thing by, I think it was NASA Goddard a few months ago on Twitter. So NASA is factoring into some of their internal planning the potential existence and cost savings of Starship, particularly for their flagship missions. I mean, the test mission, the Transiting Exoplanet Survey satellite, is up there now looking for exoplanets around the brightest stars. That was launched on a Falcon 9 in April of last year. So NASA's science is already taking advantage of the lower cost of SpaceX. NASA human spaceflight may have a little bit more of inertia, because there's a lot of jobs that are dependent on the SLS program, and a lot of very powerful people are backing and supporting it. So I do think that SLS will actually launch, but I would be surprised if it launches more than once or twice before it's held in reserve. It may be kept in reserve for critical missions of national security, because once you have something like Starship working, and by working, if SpaceX meet their current plans of getting Starship, and let's get some nice footage of Starship, the Starhopper being developed while I'm talking about this. So here's some aerial drone footage of SpaceX's site at Boca Chica in Texas, where a Starhopper prototype is being developed at the moment, a Starship prototype is being developed, which should hopefully be having some hop tests within, perhaps, the least I hope is within the next week or so. It had a static fire just in the last week. Because SpaceX are still developing the Raptor engines on the base of this. So that's why the hop tests are a little bit behind schedule. So potentially we could see an orbital class Starship launching by the end of 2020. If that timeline is stuck to, and SLS is delayed to 2021, I don't think NASA will cancel SLS. But once Starship starts flying repeatedly into orbit, successfully, and maybe even into orbit around the moon, possibly by 2023, then I think serious political pressure is going to be mounted on NASA. And that's the point where the drone decides to start moving. Cool. Because ultimately, it comes down to money. If it can be proven that Starship can launch things into orbit for, let's say, for the sake of argument, 1/100th of the cost of SLS, and you can launch more cargo into orbit, and Starship already has the safety record, then in that case, why keep SLS? So I would predict, and my YouTube channel has been around for 5 years, so I hope that you'll come back here in 5 years and check the validity of my projection here. But I would not be surprised if SLS was cancelled by 2025. So let's see how accurate my prediction is. Great question has just come in from Binium Gaming. Will it be cheaper to build telescopes on the moon than launch them from Earth in the future? Great question, because there are some fantastic opportunities for what you could do on the moon for astronomy, especially radio astronomy, for instance. Build a radio telescope on the far side of the moon, and you don't have to worry about interference from the Earth. If the telescope can be built using local resources, because if you already have, for example, a 3D printing manufacturing architecture on the moon, then yes, it could be cheaper. But I don't think the reason why telescopes will be built on the moon will be because it will be cheaper. I think it will be scientific arguments. For example, the lower gravity of the moon means that you can build larger telescopes than you can on the Earth. Because on Earth, there's a limit to how large you can make a mirror before they start to just sag and deform due to the gravity of the Earth. That's why large telescopes like the European Extremely Large Telescope, which will be 39 meters in diameter, should be online in 2025, is not one 40-meter diameter mirror, it's many segmented mirrors. On the moon, the lower gravity means that you could build larger mirrors, and hence you could do far more promising astronomy. Some of you will have heard, for example, not that long ago, the Event Horizon Telescope, which was an interferometer built from telescopes all around the Earth, produced the first image of a black hole's event horizon. Imagine what you could do if you had a telescope array on the moon that you combined with an imaging system on the Earth to have an effective baseline between the Earth and the moon. That would be an absolute game changer, because you can't go much bigger than having a telescope with an effective size as large as the Earth, like the Event Horizon Telescope achieved. So there are fascinating scientific arguments, and I think that those will outweigh the cost arguments. But yeah, really, really great question. I'm really liking your questions today. Please keep them up. So while I wait for a few more of your questions to come in, there's one other thing that I wanted to talk about, which was mentioned in one of your comments right at the beginning, which is the feasibility, at least in terms of NASA's current plans, of getting to Mars in the near future. So there is a report which came out in February of this year, an independent report by the Science and Technology Policy Institute, which studied whether, even with, hypothetically, an unlimited budget, NASA would be able to achieve an orbital mission to Mars by 2033. The short answer of the report, and I will link to this report down below if you're interested, it's well worth a read, is that even if NASA had infinite funding, at least with their current plans in terms of how long it takes to build things, they wouldn't be able to get to Mars by 2033 in any envisioned timeline. 2037 would be a potential timeline if NASA's budget was increased by a few percent every year. But the report's authors state that 2039, just for the orbital mission, would be a more feasible timeline. So in practice, that could mean that, at least in terms of NASA's current plans, you're talking the 2040s before we get the first landing on Mars. And that's even if they have a moderate budget increase and factoring in a few delays. So this is why I think the way that we'll see Mars missions happen will be public-private partnerships. Obviously, there's a lot of attention on SpaceX's Starship, which is part of the reason why it's a big focus on this channel. And thanks very much for the super chat there, Binion Gaming, and thanks very much for your question as well. I really enjoyed it. Keep up the great questions, everyone. So, my suspicion is that NASA is going to be shocked, but in a good way, when Starship enters the field. And I mean, I try and be balanced. I don't just want to focus on SpaceX. There is also really the potential for example, Blue Origin's New Glenn to also really contribute to the field here. But I just cite those two examples because they're rockets being designed to be reusable. And reusability is how you're going to survive in the launch industry in the 21st century. It's a pity when you see rockets being developed like the Ariane 6 at the moment, which is being developed to be cost competitive with the expendable Falcon 9. And obviously, we're many years beyond that. There are Falcon 9s that have been reused 3 times now already. So you need to have reusability in order to be able to survive. And this is a good thing. It will lower launch costs for everyone. So the only 2 players in the game that I see in the launch industry, in the long term, unless the big aerospace companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing really innovate and change their approach, are SpaceX and Blue Origin, with Starship and New Glenn and potentially New Armstrong, which should come in the future. So, okay, back to your questions. And hopefully that partly answers the title of this video, so I don't get accused of being too clickbaity. If NASA has funding and they stick to their current plans, 2040s is when I suspect, and many costed reports suspect, they'll land on Mars. But if there's a public-private partnership and they utilize Starship, for example, if SpaceX developed the landing system, but NASA astronauts went on the first mission, then it's absolutely possible that we could see the first humans landing on Mars, perhaps in the second half of the 2020s. So I think this will all happen much sooner than anyone expects. So keep an eye out on these next generation reusable rockets, everyone. Okay, so Bill Gebel, and apologies if I pronounced that wrong, has been doing a good job reading other people's comments and has mentioned that many people are coming to the conclusion that SLS and Gateway should be scrapped and that commercial concerns are the way to go. So, as I say, I mean, I try and be balanced and impartial and discuss I don't care how we get to the moon, how we get to Mars, so long as it happens. And that also means that I'm also very interested in China and India's moon ambitions. And I haven't mentioned, actually, that India has a moon mission that they should be launching, I think, in the next week, if I remember correctly, which will be their second big mission after an orbiter they sent in 2008. And this one will actually try and land on the moon. Obviously, early this year, China landed on the far side, the first time that has been achieved. I just want us to go as a species, because it's inspiring, it gets children and young people interested in space, and ultimately our future is in space. We need to get industry up there, we need to get science operating there, we need to solve mysteries like how life itself began, that we can only really do on places like Mars or the moons of Jupiter, at least in our own solar system. So I'm happy to cover everyone, but that being said, there is a lot of skepticism that we hear about SLS and about Gateway, but I have really been... My optimism has been renewed by the recent push by the current administration to try and accelerate the moon program, and especially the realization that Gateway, which was originally planned to be launched in SLS, for example, which would be hugely costly, is now being outcontracted to the private sector. So if NASA gradually accepts that the private sector is not competition, but they can be useful, you can get you can get things done cheaper and quicker, then I think NASA has a great future in human spaceflight. Obviously, their science program and Earth observation programs are already incredible, and they're doing great work, and especially their science outreach. But human spaceflight in the 21st century, NASA absolutely has a role, but perhaps if they change more to be a management agency, they plan the missions, they give out seed funding and grants to develop the technologies, and obviously they train astronauts. That would be a way where NASA could be more cost-effective and achieve more in the 21st century, but they shouldn't be building their own rockets unless they can be cost-effective. Okay, so more of your comments. It's great to see how many are coming in at the moment. It's tricky to catch up. Okay, so OXEAC7 asks, how much of an issue will space debris be for future missions, especially given the Starlink constellation of 12,000 satellites? Which you can find more details about, by the way, in my last Mars mission update from May. So, Starlink is being designed from the get-go to have sufficiently low orbits that even if something goes wrong with one of the missions, one of the satellites I should say, it will deorbit within about 5 years or so. So Starlink itself would not be that much of an issue, but if you have obviously higher satellites, or if you have countries that decide to show off their geopolitical muscle by launching a missile at their satellites, which we've seen too much of in the last decade, then space junk becomes more of an issue. But I do want to give a shout out. There is actually a UK-based mission which has recently been in orbit trialing technologies for space junk removal. Things like a harpoon system and a net, and unfortunately I don't have the animations here to show it, but if you Google, I don't know, UK space janitors, which should definitely be a team name, or UK space junk removal, then you'll find that there is some fascinating research going on there, but we really need to get our act together. Not just us, like different national programs, but we all need to collectively agree an international framework to remove space junk. Ideally, if you want to stop the so-called Kessler syndrome, where you get exponential growth of debris in orbit, then you would have to be removing one large satellite at the end of every satellite mission lifetime. So for every mission that goes up, you want to deorbit an old defunct satellite. That's the only way to stop spiraling out of control there. And there's very little movement at the moment towards actually legislating for that to happen. Graveheart reflects many of your views. I don't want to wait for the 2040s. Good news. You won't have to. I am very optimistic. I mean, my personal projection is I would be very, very surprised if we don't see the first people landing on Mars by 2031. And as many of you know, obviously, in the long term, I myself would like to go to Mars. I want to investigate things like the origin of life there. And I will sign up for any endeavour, public or private, as long as obviously there's not things like citizen restrictions, which stops me for applying to NASA, for example. Then I'm more than happy to do that. But in lieu of that, for example, the European Space Agency, which I could apply for, hasn't done an astronaut selection since 2009, so they're pretty infrequent. But yeah, I don't think we'll have to wait for the 2040s. There are enough endeavours focused on it, and now it's not we don't just have to rely on governments changing administrations and changing policies. Now we have a private sector which is really committed to doing this and doing this fast. So stay optimistic, everyone. I think we'll be on Mars by no later than 2031. Do let me know in the comments down below what your own projections are, incidentally. Let's see, more questions. Mel Jarvis, will it be possible to push traditional tyrants, his terms or her term, not mine, so Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, for example, from Moon-Mars colonization, given how important so the point here, ultimately, these large traditional aerospace companies, they care about money and they care about contracts. When they start losing their contracts because they're being out-competed by new space companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX, which can just do it cheaper, then they'll start to panic. They're already panicking to a certain extent. There may even be some reusability in United Launch Alliance's Vulcan rocket, which is being developed for the, I think 2020... Okay, I won't quote the date because I don't know off the top of my head, but roughly early 2020s. So they'll have to move over to reusability. They'll have to be more cost-effective if they want to survive. And survival of your income is a very good motivator for traditional companies. So I do think they will innovate, but at the moment, they're still trying to just stay as long as they can in the old paradigm. But eventually they will innovate, I'm sure. Alex Hansen asks, when will the SpaceX Dragon capsule send American astronauts to the International Space Station? Great question. Obviously, we saw the first demonstration mission to the space station earlier this year. SpaceX then unfortunately suffered an incident where that Dragon capsule, which was returned, exploded. They recently revealed that it was a valve problem that caused this. Although there isn't an official date for Demo 2, when astronauts would first go on a Dragon 2 to the space station, the latest projection I heard from Elon Musk would have SpaceX being ready around 6 months from now. So no earlier than early next year, I would say, and factor in a few potential delays from things like space station scheduling. Spring or summer of 2020 is when we'll probably see the first astronauts going up on Dragon 2. So it could be an interesting year next year. First astronauts going on Dragon 2, first orbital Starship, well, maybe not going all the way to orbit, but doing hop tests of maybe 10 kilometers or higher into the Earth's atmosphere. It'll be an exciting year for SpaceX next year. So it's a pity that there was that slight delay there with Crew Dragon, but ultimately, if you want to do it safely, what is an extra 6 months? SpaceX are doing really well at the moment when it comes to the commercial crew program. So, let's see. Other questions? Okay, so Sisinin Divin asks, what about my postdoc position and what does it mean for my YouTube videos? So, great question. So, I do have some good news for you all that has just come in just from the last week or so. So, last Wednesday, I successfully defended my PhD. In the UK, we call it a Viva because we like using Latin terms like Viva Voce, particularly at Cambridge. So I had a 3-hour grilling where I defended my work on exoplanet atmospheres. It's a pretty hefty document, 255 pages, I believe, and it will be going eventually out there in the public domain, so any of you will be able to access it, and once it's up there, I'll say in a future video, so any of you are interested can read it, because I've specifically written the introduction to be as accessible as I can make it, so it's not just full of differential equations and all that. I've designed it to give you all an overview of what we currently know about exoplanets, the exoplanet population, what we know about exoplanet atmospheres, and how we study their atmospheres. I do also touch a little bit on things like the possibility of detecting biosignatures, but perhaps that's something that I should talk more about in a future video. So, the PhD defense is sorted. I passed, I'm pleased to say. I have some minor corrections which I'll be making over the next week. And then, just over a week from now, I fly out to Canada. I'll be going out into the Canadian wilderness for 3 weeks. So if I disappear from social media, don't worry. I've not gone off to Mars. I'll just be without an interconnection in Canada. I start at Cornell University on the 1st of September for my postdoctoral position, where I'll be doing research, basically getting us ready for looking at exoplanet atmospheres with the James Webb Space Telescope at the Carl Sagan Institute. So I will still be producing YouTube videos. So I had been planning and hoping to put together a Mars mission update at the end of this month, but the big event that I was really waiting for, and I know that many of you are waiting for, was to be a presentation that Elon Musk originally was planning to give at the end of June on the latest developments in the design of Starship and about the Starhopper program. But because of engineering refinements in Raptor, the Raptor engine, that has been pushed back slightly. So that talk, whenever it is, will probably end up being in late this month or early next month, perhaps. And so there won't be time before I disappear into Canada to make a Mars mission update. So my plan will be that I'll put together a Mars mission update after I'm settled in Cornell around the end of September. And if I do post regular updates on my channel page, if you go onto YouTube, click on my channel and go on the community page, whenever I know when a video is about to come out, I post an update there. If you go on my Twitter page, at Martian Colonist, I do also try and provide updates on how I'm doing. And if you pester me on Twitter and ask, when's the next video coming out, Ryan? I will reply, because I don't get that many pests on there. And I always try and be open about the timelines I'm working towards. So these YouTube videos are not going anywhere. I will be going dark for the next 2 months or so while I'm in Canada. I'll be going up to Newfoundland, by the way, going on hikes. It's going to be pretty great. And while I'm obviously settling in to Cornell while I move there. So the YouTube videos will continue. Probably the next one will be in late September. And when I start my postdoc, I will try and make the mission updates as regular as I can. It depends a little bit on the frequency of big news coming out as it concerns Mars missions. And not just SpaceX, I'll cover anyone which is developing a system which will get us to Mars, or developing technology for us to be able to survive on the surface. I'll cover anything. And if you ever do have a suggestion of a particular company or government or anyone doing something Mars related that you want me to cover, just comment on any of my videos, because I do check those whenever I can. So ideally, I would like to make a video once every month or once every 2 months once I'm settled in Cornell. And I'll update you all on that at the end of September, once I have a better idea of how the workflow works there. So with that, I think we have just about covered pretty much everything that I wanted to talk about. I'm just going to do one quick scan for any more of your live questions, just see if anyone has any burning questions. So thanks very much for all of your good wishes. I will definitely try and avoid bears while I'm in Canada, but I don't expect we'll encounter many. There won't be many polar bears where I'm going. Yeah, thanks, Calvin, for the little bear emoji there. I'm sure the real ones aren't quite that smiley. I'll be sure to take some photos, tell you what, and I'll share some in my next Mars mission update or on Twitter, so keep an eye out there. Right, so I'm going to leave it here. This live stream's looks like it's been going on for around an hour now. Thank you very much for all of your great questions that you put together today. I always enjoy holding a live stream there. For any of you that missed the live stream today, firstly, congratulations for listening through a 1 hour video. I know that's hard. Don't worry, if you drop a comment or a question down below, I will be monitoring over the next few days any comments posted on this video, and I'll reply to as many as I can. So why don't I send you off where we came, with a nice little outing from President Kennedy.
Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it.